The Dating Game is an American game show that first aired in 1965. It would go through several cancellations and relaunches over the next 5 decades and still survives to this day in the form of the celebrity dating game starring Zooey Deschanel and Michael Bolton. The basic premise, though, hasn't really changed in the 56 years since its premiere. One contestant, usually a woman, interviews 3 mystery bachelors who attempt to answer her questions in as witty and fun a way as possible, usually with plenty of sexual innuendo thrown in for good measure. At the end, the bachelorette must pick one of the 3 to go on a date with based on how good they were at answering her questions. It's the silly kind of program that's good for a laugh or two and wasting a half hour if you don't have anything else planned. One bachelor, though, who appeared on an episode in September of 1978, would become infamous in the following years, as it was soon revealed he was in the midst of a horrific spree of murders at the time of his appearance. On camera, Rodney Alcala seemed very much your average laid-back California surfer guy. He came off very charming and funny with his answers to Bachelorette Cheryl Bradshaw's questions, so much so that she selected him as the winner over the other 2 contestants, and the 2 were soon talking backstage, setting up their forthcoming date. But it was here in talking with Mr. Alcala that Cheryl began to get a bad feeling. In speaking with Rodney, Miss Bradshaw got a very creepy vibe from the man she'd selected to go on a date with her the next evening. So much so that the next morning when she woke up, she decided she couldn't go through with it and called the show's producers to cancel. She had no way of knowing at the time, but this decision likely saved her life. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23, 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. He was raised mainly by his mother, as the family was abandoned by his father when Rodney was still very young. From an early age, Mr. Alcala was considered a charmer by many who knew him. He was quite popular in school and well liked by his fellow students and teachers alike. In 1961, after graduating, he joined the U.S. Army, where he worked as a desk clerk for the next 3 years. In 1964, the issues that would define the rest of Rodney's life first began rearing their head. He went AWOL from the Army after a self-described nervous breakdown, and left his station in Fort Bragg to hitchhike back to his mother's home in California. After being caught and returning to the military, he spoke with an Army psychiatrist who diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, resulting in a medical discharge later that year. He went to college after this, studying photography and film at UCLA, where he seemed to fit in quite well and was starting to build a future for himself as a photographer. Though in 1968, his life would take a horrific turn as the truly monstrous nature of Rodney Alcala finally revealed itself. LAPD officer Chris Camacho was alerted by a witness who saw the 25-year-old Alcala lure a little girl into his car and drive off with her. Camacho and other officers quickly arrived at Rodney's Hollywood apartment and forced their way inside, where they made a horrific discovery inside Alcala's kitchen. 8-year-old Tally Shapiro laid on the floor, barely clinging to life. She had been sexually assaulted and severely beaten by a steel pipe that laid on the ground next to her. It was a gruesome scene that Officer Camacho says has stuck with him for the rest of his life. The apartment was thoroughly searched, but Rodney was nowhere to be found, having escaped just as police arrived at his apartment. The search for Alcala would take over 2 years, and in the meantime he would begin a new life across the country in New York City, living under the alias John Berger. Using this alias, Rodney would enroll in the film program at NYU and get a job as a counselor at a New Hampshire art camp for children. And it would be during his stay in New York where Mr. Alcala would strike again. In June of 1971, 23-year-old flight attendant Cornelia Criley was found strangled to death in her Manhattan apartment. Her killer had sexually assaulted her, then strangled her with a nylon stocking, then bit her on her left breast and proceeded to stuff a second stocking into her mouth post-mortem. Police found themselves confronting several hurdles during the investigation. For starters, Cornelia's front door had been locked. In fact, in order to even get inside her apartment, NYPD officers needed to climb a fire escape that ran down the back of her building. This meant that either the person who had killed her was let in by Miss Criley or had climbed the fire escape and broken into her apartment. No witnesses had seen anyone near or around Cornelia's apartment, and none of her neighbors had heard or saw anyone suspicious hanging around. There were also no valuables or money missing from her home, which ruled out robbery as a motive and made the case basically cold on arrival. Police made an impression of the bite marks and attempted to match it to known locals with a criminal history, but unfortunately came up short. At this point, Rodney Alcala or John Berger were names that no one within the NYPD had ever heard of or believed had any remote connection to Cornelia Criley. And with the city recording a then record high 1,466 homicides that year, it was unfortunately a crime that was quickly swept under the rug and would remain forgotten for the better part of the next 40 years. Meanwhile, in California, police hadn't forgotten about the vicious crime Alcala had committed against Tally Shapiro, and were determined to make him face justice for it. Eventually, the FBI became involved in the manhunt, which had now been going on for almost 2 years, and Mr. Alcala was placed on their top 10 most wanted list. This resulted in posters of Rodney being distributed all over the country, even as far as New York City, where Alcala continued to live in hiding under the name John Berger. It was not long after that 2 students who attended the New Hampshire art camp where Rodney was an instructor noticed a wanted poster with his picture in a local post office and contacted police. Alcala was arrested and extradited to California to stand trial for the sexual assault and savage beating of Tally Shapiro. However, almost immediately, the prosecution proved more difficult than the state's attorney's office was anticipating. For starters, Tally and her family had now relocated to Mexico, far away from California and the traumatic memories of what had happened to the young girl. Tally was also now almost 11 years old, and her parents didn't want her to have to go into a courtroom and recount the painful memory of that fateful day, much less have to look at the man who attacked her in the eyes. They wanted their child to simply be able to move on with her life, and do everything she could to forget the horrific experience she'd endured, and refused to have her come back to the US and testify. Now, while this may be understandable from the parents' perspective, it made prosecuting Alcala much more difficult. Initially, the state wanted to charge him with rape and attempted murder, but without Tally's testimony, prosecutors feared that these charges were less likely to stick and decided to cut a deal with Alcala where he would plead guilty to child molestation and avoid the other, much more serious charges. This resulted in him being sentenced to just 3 years in prison, which I think almost anyone would agree was too short of a prison term. And at this point, New York police had yet to connect him to the murder of Cornelia Criley, which in retrospect makes the very short prison sentence all the more worse. Mr. Alcala would spend just 17 months in prison and was paroled in 1974, where not even 2 months after his release, he was again arrested after he was found with a 13-year-old girl who claimed Rodney had kidnapped her. For whatever reason, he was only charged with giving marijuana to a minor and violation of parole, and again given a very minuscule jail sentence. 2 years later, after a state psychiatrist determined Rodney was successfully rehabilitated, he was again released on parole. And by now, I'm sure many of you watching this are shaking your heads at the blatant failures of the California justice system in this case. By this point in our story, Mr. Alcala had viciously assaulted and beaten an 8-year-old girl, and possibly attempted to do this again to a 13-year-old girl, and hadn't even spent 4 years in jail as a result of both crimes. And yes, while Rodney's charm and charisma certainly played a part in helping him convince psychiatrists and the parole board he was worthy of early release, these were systemic issues affecting the entire state during this decade, as Orange County prosecutor Matt Murphy, who was previously featured on this channel a few months back in our video on Daniel Wozniak, pointed out, quote, "The 1970s in California was insane as far as treatment of sexual predators. Rodney Alcala is a poster boy for this. It is a total comedy of outrageous stupidity." This comedy of outrageous stupidity continued after Rodney's second release in 1977, as despite his status as a known flight risk, his parole officer at the time made the extremely strange decision to allow him to leave the state and travel to New York, where a short time after arriving, he once again left his bloody mark on the state. Ellen Jane Hoover was the poster child of a New York socialite. Her father had once owned a nightclub in Hollywood, California, and she was the goddaughter of Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. Growing up, she rubbed elbows with some of the most famous people in the world, and as a result felt very safe and comfortable under the bright lights of Manhattan. In July of 1977, though, the bubbly 23-year-old had gone missing. She was scheduled to go on a lunch date with a photographer from which she never returned, and the only clue as to what happened to her was a name written down in her planner, John Berger. For the next year, police and family searched for the missing woman, hoping she had simply decided to run off somewhere without telling anyone. Those hopes were dashed when a year later, her partially skeletal remains were found buried on the grounds of the Rockefeller estate in Westchester County. By now, it was well known to New York police that John Berger was in fact Rodney Alcala, and the Rockefeller estate where Miss Hoover's body had been found was a preferred photography location for him when he lived in New York City. The FBI questioned him about the killing, which he vehemently denied, and unfortunately, with nothing more than circumstantial evidence, law enforcement was hesitant to place him under arrest for the murder. As a result, the family of Ellen Hoover would need to wait over 30 years to finally get answers regarding her brutal killing. Mr. Alcala's trip to New York in 1977 lasted only a week. He would drive back home to California, where the pace of his killings rapidly increased. Later that year, he murdered 18-year-old Jill Barcombe and 27-year-old Georgia Wixted, both of whom had been beaten, assaulted, and strangled in a similar brutal manner to Cornelia Criley in 1971, though police at the time were unable to connect these crimes to anyone. In 1978, he took a job as a typesetter for the Los Angeles Times, and worked as an amateur photographer on the side. He would soon amass a portfolio of hundreds of pictures, many of which included nude photographs of underage children whom he'd convinced to pose for him under the guise of being a fashion photographer. Years later, one of the teenage girls who'd modeled for Alcala recalled the encounter, saying, quote, "He said he was a professional, so in my mind I was being a model for him. He showed me his portfolio, which included several pictures of naked teenage boys. I look back now and I can't believe I was so trusting." It was also during this time that Rodney made his infamous appearance on The Dating Game, where despite being a convicted sex offender, he was given the all clear by the show's producers to compete as a bachelor, who later insisted they were unaware of Mr. Alcala's criminal past when he auditioned. Thankfully, Cheryl Bradshaw, who had selected Rodney to go on a date with her, thought better of it and canceled the plans immediately. Later that year, he would take the life of Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary who was found strangled and beaten in the laundry room of her apartment building. And almost exactly a year later, in July of 1979, he would murder 21-year-old Jill Parento in the living room of her apartment. With each murder, Alcala's crimes became more heinous and brazen. Just a week after killing Miss Parento, though, he would commit the crime that would ultimately seal his fate. 12-year-old Robin Samsoe was a native of Huntington Beach, California, who disappeared after a ballet class in July of 1979. 12 days later, her beaten and partially nude body was found in the foothills of Los Angeles. Almost immediately, though, Robin's friends had an idea of the person who'd perpetrated this ghastly crime. They told police that while they were hanging out on the beach earlier that day, a man had approached the group introducing himself as a photographer and asking if they wanted to pose for pictures. They declined and quickly got away from the stranger, though a short time later they saw Robin speaking with the man just before she went off to her class. That man was Rodney Alcala, and it is believed that he arranged to pick up Robin from her ballet class under the pretense he would take modeling pictures for her, only to attack and murder the young girl shortly after she got in his car. Police issued a search warrant for Alcala's mother's home, which was his place of residence at the time. There, they didn't find any evidence linking him directly to Robin's murder, but did find a receipt for a storage locker Rodney was renting in Seattle, Washington. Traveling north, police searched the storage unit where they found the gold earrings Robin had been wearing the day of her disappearance. Rodney Alcala was immediately placed under arrest and charged with the brutal murder of Robin Samsoe. Though Rodney was now in police custody, he was still at the time only believed to be responsible for one murder. It would take 2 decades and a winding saga of legal battles before the depths to Rodney Alcala's crimes were truly revealed. In 1980, Rodney Alcala was put on trial for the murder of Robin Samsoe, and compared to the web of legal battles that would come in the following decades, it was a relatively straightforward affair. Alcala was found guilty for the rape and murder of Robin and was sentenced to death. However, this conviction was short-lived as it was discovered the jury had been improperly informed of his previous sex crimes, which was ruled inadmissible. This resulted in the California State Supreme Court overturning his conviction, and a second trial took place in 1986, where again Mr. Alcala was found guilty of first-degree murder and again sentenced to death. However, this conviction was also overturned in 2001 by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. For a reason so incredibly bizarre, I had to do a double take when I read about it. Mr. Alcala and his defense alleged that the park ranger who'd found Robin's body had been hypnotized by police officers, and they had a witness who could supposedly back up this claim. However, the presiding judge in the 1986 trial did not allow this witness to be called, which the Ninth Circuit Court believed was enough cause for Alcala and his legal team to successfully argue judicial bias and overturn the conviction. In 2003, prosecutors were preparing for a third trial, which they believed would be another drawn-out legal battle. Though while making their preparations for it, they got some unexpected good news. Police had decided to employ the technology of DNA fingerprinting, which wasn't widely available in 1986 like it was in 2003. Comparing DNA samples obtained from Rodney to bodily fluid samples found at the Robin Samsoe crime scene revealed a match. Additionally, cold case detectives working several unsolved murders in California had compared Alcala's DNA to semen and bloodstains found at the crime scene of several old cases. These included the then unsolved murders of Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wixted, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parento, with Mr. Alcala's DNA being a match in all of these cases. Prosecutors had gone from a situation where they were worried about even getting one conviction to one where they had proof Alcala was now responsible for at least 5 murders. The state of California presented this evidence to a judge and filed a motion to roll Robin Samso's case in with the other 4 and put Rodney on trial for all 5. After 3 more years of legal battles, this motion was granted in 2006 by the California Supreme Court, and in 2010, Alcala was convicted of all 5 murders and again sentenced to death. In 2011, prosecutors for the state of New York linked DNA from Rodney Alcala to the then unsolved murders of Cornelia Criley and Ellen Jane Hoover. This time, Rodney accepted a plea deal and in 2013 was handed down a life sentence for both murders. In addition to the 7 murders he was convicted for, police believe he may be responsible for several other crimes that have yet to be discovered. In 2011, over 100 photographs taken from Mr. Alcala's collection were released to the public. These photos feature many unidentified women and children, whom police believe may have been potential victims of Rodney Alcala's heinous killing spree, and at least want to confirm whether or not the people in these photographs survived their encounter with him. A link to all of these will be available in the description, and if you recognize anyone in them, I'd encourage you to contact the number listed on the website. Rodney Alcala spent the remainder of his life on death row, as the death penalty in California has largely become a symbolic gesture, with the last execution taking place in 2006 and Governor Gavin Newsom officially placing a moratorium on the practice in 2019. In July of 2021, Rodney Alcala died of natural causes in his cell on death row at the age of 77. To this day, police are still investigating leads and searching for any connection he may have to various other unsolved murders across the United States. As always, if any of you watching this have any information regarding potential crimes committed by Rodney Alcala, I'd encourage you to contact Orange County Police so that any additional victims in this story can finally be given justice. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.